Morning. Another day, another real-world test. Today, we're doing it on the iPhone 13. Not the professionals, not the baby, the reg. Now, if you're not familiar, I'm gonna go throughout my day with the phone. We'll take some photos on it, some of its competitors, other iPhones as well, and put those up on the screen so you can see how it does. Also talk about some of the features I like and don't like, and by the end of the day, we'll check in on the battery, and we'll explore while we do all of that. But, first things first. Okay, we are now crossing the Pulaski Bridge into a neighborhood called Long Island City. Now, Long Island City is a neighborhood just over the Newtown Creek, which separates Greenpoint, which is where my office is, in the borough of Brooklyn, from the borough of Queens, which is where we are now. It actually was its own little city in the 1800s until 1898, when it and the rest of Queens all got absorbed by New York City. Now, it's always kind of been an industrial neighborhood, like most areas near the water here in New York City. But in 2001, it was rezoned from industrial to residential, and it exploded with the number of high-rise apartment buildings. Amazon even in 2018 tried to put their HQ2 headquarters here, and were met with a lot of opposition, to the point where they kind of canceled it. Like most large neighborhoods here in New York City, it has a bunch of like sub-neighborhoods. The one that we're gonna be exploring today is called Hunters Point, and it's the southernmost neighborhood here. It's also kind of where there's a big concentration of all the restaurants and bars. Coffee, check. This is a place called Sweet Leaf Coffee. They actually have a location in Greenpoint right next to my office, and they used to have a location right next to my apartment in Williamsburg, which sadly closed. They actually roast their own coffee and brew from that. And well, their coffee cups say things like blend of art and science, because they're a bit of coffee nerds, which as a nerd myself, I can appreciate. Now, I want to apologize in advance if you've seen my iPhone 13 Pro real world test, because there's gonna be a lot of overlap between these, but hopefully some new things, and also obviously from a different perspective. So, firstly, you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference between the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 12. Technically, there's a 0.01 inch difference in thickness, and it's a hair heavier, but you're probably not gonna notice either. Now, the things you will notice is the larger cameras on the back, and the fact that they're diagonal now instead of stacked. And this is how others will know that you have a new iPhone and not last year's iPhone. Also, the notch on the front is 20% smaller, which you probably won't really notice because there's not much that kind of happens up in that area, but a smaller notch, always appreciated. Now, compared to the rest of the 13 series, the 13 is the same size basically as the 13 Pro, with a 6.1 inch screen versus the 5.4 inch of the new Mini and 6.7 inches of the Pro Max. Now, the Mini and the regular 13 are kind of grouped together in the same tier, I guess we'll call it. They just have different screen sizes to choose from, and obviously other things like battery size, etc. And the 13 Pro and the 13 Pro Max are kind of their own little slightly higher tier, but same concept of just a difference in screen size and battery. In terms of design, that means that they have a matte glass back instead of the glossy one that we have here, just like the 12 Pros versus the 12s. They also have a stainless steel frame instead of the aluminum one that we have here in the 13. Also aesthetically, you'll notice an extra camera on the back, which we'll get to later. Now, the design is so similar to the 12 that if you were a fan of that design, you're gonna be a fan of this one, like I was, and I am. I personally like the flat edges of both of the series. It just feels and looks different. And it also reminds me of the iPhone 4, which I also just kind of like. Now, real quick, if you want to protect that design, we should talk about today's sponsor, Rhino Shield. Now, Rhino Shield makes cases that aren't just extremely impact protective, they also look good. I also like that they're just not bulky, frankly. They have their Solid Suit line, that is their no-fuss protective case that comes in a ton of designs, colors, and finishes, but they also have their modular Mod NX case, which allows you to mix and match a backplate with various case rim colors, but also swap out the backplate for a bumper case if that's more your style. They also have a ton of exclusive cases from NASA, PewDiePie, League of Legends, and a ton of others. And you can even design your own case with your own images and text. They have cases for all the new iPhones, as well as cases for the Apple Watch, and even your AirPods, as well as many flagship ship Android phones too. They also ship worldwide and have free shipping for qualified orders, as well as a lifetime warranty in all of their cases. Head to the link in the description below and use coupon code UNLOCKER13 to get 20% off for the first week after this video goes live and 10% off after that. Thanks again to Rhino Shield for sponsoring this video. And a short walk from that coffee shop is the Pepsi Cola famous neon sign here in Gantry Plaza State Park. It was originally built in 1940 and was on top of the Pepsi bottling factory that had been over here. They were one of the original industrial plants in Long Island City. And at the time, a lot of the factories over here were installing these giant signs so that people in Manhattan could see them from across the river. By 2003, the PepsiCo bottling factory was actually closed and a park was built in its place, this park. And they actually made a deal with the city where they said the sign should live on here on the Long Island waterfront. And the city agreed. And the park is where a lot of people come to picnic, especially in the summer. And a lot of the residents of Queens come to this park in particular because of, well, obviously the view and the well-kept boardwalk. It's also it's quiet here. Well, I say that relatively speaking. There's still helicopters and ferries. It's relatively quiet for New York City. Okay, let's talk about the screen. The screen on the 13 is very similar to the screen on the 12. We have similar support for Dolby Vision, HDR10, and the same peak 1200 nits of brightness, which only actually happens when you watch HDR content, by the way. And they have the same resolution, and they're again the same 6.1 inch in size. The only difference on paper is that the 13 is 800 nits for its brightness versus the 625 of the 12. So it's a bit brighter. Now, honestly, for me, even putting them side by side, it's a little hard to tell that there's much of a difference. But regardless, in the real world, I can tell you right now that the iPhone 12 had a bright enough screen for me to see in pretty much any scenario, and the 13 does as well. Now, going for the 13 Pro or the Pro Max will get you an even slightly brighter screen, but it'll also get you a 120 hertz screen. Now, basically that means that it'll refresh up to 120 times a second instead of the usual 60 times a second like the 13 here does. This allows for smoother animations, smoother scrolling, and gameplay. And it is a feature I do appreciate about the Pro models, but it is subtle. That's just another thing to consider when trying to decide between the 13 and the 13 Pro and if it's worth the money, which hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a better idea of. And just a little further south in Gantry Plaza State Park, we have another iconic sign, the Long Island sign. Now, the reason this sign is here is because technically this is the beginning of Long Island, which is a, well, very long island that Brooklyn and Queens are both a part of, and it goes all the way and ends at Montauk, which we did a video not too long ago if you want to check that out to learn more about there. And the sign sits on one of the things that gives this park its name, a gantry. And there's a collection of these here that have been restored, and they were originally built in 1925 to load and unload rail car floats and barges for people trying to travel between Manhattan and Queens. And they just kind of stand as yet another reminder of this neighborhood's very industrial past. So we still have the same as the iPhone 12's ultra-wide camera with a 12 megapixel f2.4 aperture on paper. And even though Apple says it's, quote, faster and, quote, reveals more details in darker areas, it's not actually clear what that means hardware-wise. Now, as for the main sensor, we have the same 12 megapixel and f1.6 aperture as last year's models, but the sensor itself is a decent chunk larger. It has 1.7 micron sized pixels versus the 1.4 of last year, which means that it should collect more light. As the larger the pixel, the more light it can capture. Now, we also have sensor shift, as Apple calls it, and it's basically a stabilization involving moving the sensor itself to help negate small movements. Now, this helps with night mode or low light shots in general, just being less blurry, but it also helps with certain movements while recording video. So essentially it feels like the 13 and the 13 mini just kind of inherited the 12 Pro Max's main camera, which was the top camera of that series. Now, to compare it to the new Pro models, the 13 Pro and Pro Max now have even larger sensors that have 1.9 micron size pixels and an even faster 1.6 aperture for their main camera, and they have a 1.8 aperture that's faster for their ultra wide. And like last year, they also include a telephoto that this time is 3 times optical zoom instead of the 2 and 2.5 times of the 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max respectively. Now, in addition to the hardware bump though, Apple added something called creative modes. Now, these are found on all of the new 13 series, but they're basically LUTs, or lookup tables in my mind at least, which photographers use to change the conversion values for colors. So you can change a specific green to another shade, or a totally different color for that matter, and same for the shade of black and white to affect the contrast as well. Now, Apple essentially made a few presets for these that you can select when taking a photo to make it look more contrasty or warmer, cooler, etc. And you can customize each of these slightly to create your own custom versions of them. Now, it's not something I would personally use, as I like to do those types of things after the fact, if I even do them at all. But I could see where it could be useful for some people who might want to take one of those, adjust it slightly, and then kind of always take their photos with that mode to just kind of change all of their photos as soon as they take them to a look that they maybe prefer. And lastly, for photos, at least if you're debating between the 13 Pro or the 13, there is a macro mode on the Pro models that's not on the regular model. And that allows you to take closer up photos, usually within centimeters. Personally, and I'll leave a link to the iPhone 13 Pro video below if you want to see, but macro mode automatically switched. And it was so annoying to me. But Apple did say that they are going to fix this, and at the time of making this video, it seems like it is actually in the beta version that just came out, so it's coming soon. But in my opinion, macro mode is something that's kind of fun to like try out for a bit, but you probably won't end up using it once the novelty wears off. And so I wouldn't really use that mode as a consideration of whether you should buy a Pro or not, unless you're like super into the reproductive parts of your local flowers. Now, this is a restaurant called Casa Enrique. It's an amazing Mexican restaurant that was actually started by a chef who used to work at a French restaurant called Café Henri. And his brother actually convinced him to start his own restaurant serving food that they grew up with in Mexico. Casa Enrique is actually a Spanish translation of Café Henri, and they even have the same dog in the logo. He's now just sporting a sombrero. Now, they opened it in 2012 and got a Michelin star in 2014, becoming the first Mexican restaurant in New York City to receive that honor. They then got one every year since. Now, despite that though, it's not pretentious in any way. It's just really good Mexican food. Now, for video, comparing the 13 to the 12, I can't tell too much of a difference, except that, well, that stabilization is a little bit better because of the sensor shift that we mentioned earlier, and there's maybe a little bit more bokeh because of the slightly larger sensor. One thing that is different with the 13 though, is that we have a new cinematic mode. Now, essentially, it's portrait mode for video. We've seen this on other phones, of course, and I mentioned it in my 13 Pro video, but it does do a pretty decent job, and it has some good tracking, and it can also be adjusted after the fact to be less or more, and less makes it look at least a bit more natural to me. And you can even adjust who the focus is on in post, which I don't believe I've seen other video portrait modes be able to do. It can also rack the focus, as it's usually called. Now, this just means that it can slowly and smoothly adjust the focus between two subjects, usually done by slowly rotating the focus ring on a lens, for example, to have the focus change from one subject while everything else is blurred out to another, blurring out the original subject. All of this is meant to mimic the look of a much larger sensor and fast aperture lens like my Sony a7S III and f2.8 lens that does this naturally. It's novel, and again, works better than most versions I've seen, but to my eye, it just isn't something that I would use much, as I honestly just kind of prefer the natural bokeh that all the larger sensors in these cameras tend to have nowadays anyway. And I'd rather just have less bokeh that looked more natural than more that looks just a little off to my eye. Now lastly, the Pro models are about to get the ability to shoot in ProRes, which is a higher bitrate format that is just more versatile and easier to work with in a video editing program. Now we saw it in the same beta version as the macro mode setting, so it's coming soon. And a third-party company, Filmic Pro, has already added it to their camera app, which you could download for a price. But honestly, I'd have to keep testing that a bit more to really know whether or not it's something of that much value worth the getting the Pro versus the regular 13. Now this is a local dive bar across the street from Casa Enrique called Domini's Hoek. Funny enough, that's actually the original name for this area. Now New York was settled originally by the Dutch and was called New Amsterdam. The word Domini is basically a word for a minister in Dutch, and Hoek is a point. So it was named after the fact that a minister was awarded the land in 1642 and that it jutted out to a point in the river. I did a video on Red Hook, which is also like named after Red Hook because it was like red clay and it came out to a point. And in that video I asked you guys if anyone knew Dutch to help me pronounce Hoek, and you did try. I still don't really know how to pronounce it. Hoek, 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 Hoek. While we're here though, let's talk about a few last things on the phone. All of the new 13 series use the new A15 Bionic chipset compared to the A14 of last year. And I can tell you that honestly, on a normal like day-to-day basis, you're not really gonna notice a difference. Now, a commenter on the iPhone 13 Pro video did say that they noticed a difference in heat when they were playing games for a long time. So maybe you'll notice that, but again, day-to-day stuff, probably not gonna notice. Now also the Pro models have an extra GPU core, just like the MacBook Pro models do. But don't let that be a reason why you would get the Pro over this, because I can't tell, again, any difference in performance with that. The 120 Hertz, I would say, actually makes, even though again it's subtle, a bigger difference in how it feels faster than that core ever really probably would. Now we do still have MagSafe, like we did on the iPhone 12, and honestly, I appreciate it more now than I did with that phone. Here's just the amount of accessories that third parties have come out with is kind of crazy. And it's nice to see. Now the iPhone 13 is $100 more, the starting price, than the iPhone 12 was. But the iPhone 12 started at 64 gigabytes for its base storage, whereas this starts at 128. So if you do the 128 gig version of the iPhone 12, you're looking at really a $50 difference. And you can also up the storage to 256 or 512. Now on the Pro models, you can go all the way up to 1 terabyte. And a lot of that probably has to do with the ProRes option, because that will take up a lot of storage if you use that enough. Okay, calling it a night. It is now 10:09 p.m. I took it off the charger about 9 a.m. and we are at 6%. And here's my screen on time and my usage for anyone who's curious about that for today. Now, of course, keep in mind, this is a real world test. I use the camera a lot. I use the phone just a tremendous amount. So it's not a very normal day. But here is my screen on time and my usage for another much more normal day, so you can at least see both scenarios. Okay, as far as battery life is concerned, I think it's better than the 12 for sure. It's not quite as good as the 13 Pro. Again, I'll leave a link below if you want to check out how that did. But bottom line, it lasted me all of the normal day without ever touching a charger, and it was a very heavy use day. So I think most people are probably gonna be happy with that. I am very curious to see how the Pro Max does with its giant battery and how well the 13 Pro did. That's only gonna do better. And then also, of course, the 13 Mini, because the battery life wasn't great on the 12 Mini. I wanna see how much it's improved, if at all. There you go. If you wanna see more videos like this when they go live, check out the rest of the channel. Hit subscribe, ding the bell next to subscribe so that you get notified when I do them. And if you're not already, check me out on Instagram. Follow me there for some behind the scenes stuff and just like fun places I end up going and photo samples from phones and cameras and all sorts of other fun stuff. As always, I will leave links below to all the places that I visited, as well as the best prices that I could find on the phone itself. Lastly, thanks again to Rhino Shield for sponsoring this video. As always though, regardless, thanks for watching.